Carly, and welcome to this training module over project management. I was very glad to partner with the North Central Regional Planning Committee to make this video as part of an entire training series on how to open, operate, and optimize a grocery store. So this one especially, even if you're not dealing in a grocery project, I think you can find a lot of value here. But the series as a whole will be through the lens of a grocery store. So you can find more information about that below. And without further ado, let's dive right in. So before I get into covering the 6 supporting documents that go along with this video, I'm going to talk just a little bit about my personal philosophy around project management and why I've chosen to start the series with this video. Project management is really just a set of tools. So think about like when you are opening a grocery store, especially, there's a lot of different details and work to be done, and keeping track of all of that and all of those pieces, it exceeds the bounds of the human mind to be able to keep track of it in your head. So that naturally means it's going to have to come out and you're going to have to manage it outside of yourself. So that's just the nature of a large project. There's lots of people involved, there's lots of details, there's lots of dates and timelines to keep track of, and all of the things. So this is going to be a set of tools that you can use. This is not a rule book that you have to follow step by step. That is not at all what I would do. These are pieces that I think can help to tame the chaos of a large project, where it makes it manageable. That's the whole goal, is to manage all of this vast detail and information and to communicate it where you need to the proper parties. So that is what this tool set is aiming to provide. And the documents that I've created, the 6 supporting documents, my goal was to make them stand by themselves. So if you're not a new person to project management especially, or even if you just want to try to dive right in and check out the documents and see if you really need me to talk you through them or if they're self-explanatory, that was my goal, was that they would be self-explanatory. But I'm going to tell some of my stories and get into some of the details behind why we keep track of the information the way that we keep track of it, and that's what the rest of this video will be. So if you want to stick around and hang out with me and learn a little bit about the way I use project management as a tool, by all means, please do that. So the rest of this video will be me talking through the 6 supporting documents that are available below. So we'll start with project management concepts. And again, this is maybe a refresher for you if you have some experience with project management. So be sure to check out the timestamps if ever you do want to jump ahead in the material. There's plenty of options there. The first concept that we're going to talk about is the difference between project and operations. The simple definition of a project is that it's something that is needing to be created that doesn't yet exist. It's a change that you want to implement. It's buying an old building, remodeling it, and putting a grocery store in there. It's something that needs to happen that hasn't ever happened before. So that is new territory. That means that there's a lot of unknown. There's a lot of blank slate that you're creating on. And that's why we use the tools of project management to keep track of the details and help fill in the slate as we go with what we learn. Operations, on the other hand, are a set of repeatable steps. So that is very different. Obviously, it's a set of things that, especially in a grocery store, that are repeating mostly every week. Every week on Monday, it's the same set of things that happen. Every week on Tuesday, it's the same set of things that happen. So those are operations. Those are the ongoing heartbeat and breathing and the movement of your business. So operating the business versus opening the business, basically the point is that those are 2 different skill sets. So especially if you're someone who is not opening the business yourself, if you're looking to hire someone to open or manage the project of opening, keep in mind that I've seen it done, and it even was the case in my case, where the same person is intended to open the business and run the business. And chances are that's going to be a really tough combination to find, somebody that's going to be good at both. Either they're going to be suited for operations, meaning they're good at following a recipe, and there's nothing wrong with that because that is strength and stamina and single-minded focus that, I mean, a grocery store especially needs that. And in a project, it's more problem solving and something new every time you turn around, and you're constantly switching gears. You need to call the warehouse, you need to call the contractor, you need to talk to the employees, you need to get them their steps. There's constantly something different happening when you're in the project phase. And so somebody who's really good at adapting to that situation is going to be bored in operations, very basically. And somebody who's good at operations is likely going to feel like a fish out of water in the project phase. So just something to be aware of as you're hiring for both of those positions. This next concept is phases of the project. And it's easy to think that the work of accomplishing a project or building something, that it's a linear process, that you're going to spend the same amount of effort and it's like 40 hours a week, every week for 12 weeks, and bam, I got it done. And that's just not how projects generally work. So through these phases, first, there is this initiating phase where there's business planning going on and essentially dreaming of what is the finished outcome that you want to create. And that's really an important phase because you can't be effective at any of the other phases if you don't have a clear destination in mind. So that very first phase, even though it looks like on the surface that not a lot is happening, this is something that's done with a lot of solitude, to be honest with you. It doesn't look like you're really working on it, but getting clear on where it is that you're trying to go is absolutely necessary. The second part is warming up the project, and that is where the action definitely builds. It's not the height of the action, but that's where you get other people involved. That's where you get yourself a sidekick on your project or a couple of them, and you start working on to-do lists. You fill out some of the templates that we're going to get into here later in the video, and you begin engaging with the world and pulling the world into your project and pulling their energy into your project. So that warming up the project phase definitely is where it gets a lot more fun, where there's more people involved. And then you have hot project, and that part lasts only this long. It's very short phase, but the action and the intensity of what's going on is very intense. Typically, especially in the grocery project, there's a reason one of these modules is the last month, and that's the whole module, is what happens in the last month, because as far as the action goes, it's most of it. It's like every single final detail of 400 things coming into focus within the same 30 days. It's a whirlwind. So that's a hot project. That's like you're down to the wire, the deadline, and there's a lot that goes on. So again, this is kind of from that vantage point of, as far as trying to balance your expectations with doing this and something else, maybe if you're trying to work these phases alongside a job, either part-time or full-time, like I would just say, especially when you get to hot project phase, you're full-time on the project. Like you need to be there and just kind of clear your schedule of everything else. It can get a little bit intense for those last 4 to 6 weeks leading up to the grand opening date. And then the last phase is a lot like the first. It's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of just closing off loose ends. It's a lot of balancing your books and making sure you have everything that you need as far as from closing out contractor work and invoices and everything else that happened during the project. Again, it's a whirlwind. So that last phase of kind of putting a cap on everything is really helpful, making sure that you leave everything in a good place, especially since as soon as you open, you now begin the operations phase of the project. So that part, again, is a whole nother skill set, a whole nother stack of things that have nothing to do with the project. So tying off those loose ends can definitely be hard to do as far as fitting it in with now having to do all the operations tasks, but so worth it just to make sure that you leave it all where you meant to leave it. So this next section is about communication, and there's a reason I went in depth and early into so much detail about communication, because essentially that's the job of a project manager, is to communicate. And I think it's a little bit counterintuitive that the first step of communication is actually listening and learning and being aware of the information. And because you're aware, you're able to communicate it. So project management is knowing all the details and mostly, this is what you pay them for, communicating the details the way that they need to be communicated when they need to be communicated. Because I'll tell you, and this is coming from my PMP certification, that most of the problems that occur on a project are due to miscommunications. That you thought you expressed yourself and that this came through and the other person didn't receive the same thing and now they didn't do what you needed them to. It's just like that. It's like when you're dealing in a large project, there are so many sidekicks working on the project with you, so many contractors, so many warehouse people, so many people that you're dealing with. And communication is the primary role of the project manager. So again, just kind of coming to it from a place of when you're hiring who is going to open your store, you're really looking for communication skills as their primary skill set. That's what they need to have, and an ability to keep up with a large amount of changing information in a rapid pace. So as you can see, like that isn't necessarily the same job description as the store manager. I did want to recommend this video that I found a while back as far as why it's different when we think things inside of our head versus trying to say them out loud, and how we can train ourselves to be better at communicating more effectively what's inside our brains to people that are listening to us. He explains how that's a skill set. Communicating is a skill, so the more we practice it, the better we'll be at it. And that video would be a great place to start if you yourself are interested in building your communication skills. Next is social media. This is huge as far as, again, having a project manager with good communication skills, good PR skills. As far as the primary stakeholder on your project is the community where you're opening, building that rapport with them, building the relationship with them. I know that they'll be very curious about the store and what's coming and what your plans are. And especially early on, it's easy to say, we don't know. We have nothing to share. And I think I even fell into that. As far as early on, it feels so intimidating because you really don't know. I mean, everything is just one big guess in the very beginning, and you don't want to tell them something and have them get their hopes up. But there's a way to build that relationship and be able to say that, to be able to say, like, this is the stage we're in. We're in this stage where we don't know. We have some loose leaf plans. We have some ideas of directions we'd like to go. And other than that, we'll have to see what unfolds. If you have questions, if you have feedback, if you have ideas, like, send them our way. We can't promise anything, but we're always open to feedback. So even a willingness to hear from them, even when you don't have much to say, is huge. And last but not least, especially as you get into warming up the project where you're pulling other people into it with you, you will need some kind of document sharing solution, whether that's SharePoint if you're through Microsoft Office, or Google Drive even is a nice free option, especially if you're just getting started. That's what we used in the interim until we had our Microsoft Office setups. Next, we have project scope. So scope simply means, what does the project include? What is the range of work that we're trying to accomplish with this project? And the first thing that I want to introduce is my idea wall technique. And this is something that was born out of necessity because especially when you're in an early stage of a new project, it can be very overwhelming, the amount of pieces there are to keep track of. And I'll put some pictures here into the video so you can see what I mean, but I use the giant sticky notes. They come on an easel pad and you pull the sheets off and they have a sticky backing, and I line a whole wall of my office, and that gives me space to just brain dump and have ideas and jot notes down. And I can always come back and organize it later, but I've found, especially early on when you're overwhelmed in a lot of project details, writing them down does something to get them out of your head, and knowing you have it captured somewhere just lets you relax and know, like, I'm not going to lose track of that. I have it written down. And so that relaxation just lets it all be a little bit more fun, let's be honest. In terms of keeping track of a lot of different details, like for our store, we were opening a grocery store that included all of grocery, plus some DSD vendors, plus a whole meat market, plus a whole bakery that was also a hot food deli. So there were a lot of different parts. So like on my idea wall, for example, I would just carve out a space that's the bakery deli, and then every single idea that I have, I can just deposit it into that spot on the idea wall. And eventually you get far enough in where you basically have the gist of what it is that you're wanting to create. And then it's a matter of just capturing the idea wall and organizing it, typing it up, sharing it with your fellow project management teammates, and getting started on breaking down those pieces. We'll look more at that when we get to the task tracking spreadsheet template. So I do want to just talk a little bit about scope creep and the concepts of mission critical or after opening. You could also use after the close of the project, basically, or after your most critical deadline that you're trying to meet. This is where, as you go, new ideas will emerge and new things that you want to accomplish that would be a really good fit with your project, they'll show up and you'll be able to see them now because you're closer to it and you're more into it. And now we know, oh, we don't just want to do this, we actually want it to be like this. So that's scope creep. That's when basically the danger of scope creep, and this is why we're wary of it, and we control for it as much as possible, is that basically you would never be done. You would never get to your actual deadline. You would just constantly add more and more and more to the project so that it's never over, and projects end when they're finished. So at a certain point, there's this column where we're deciding, is this mission critical or can it wait for after opening? Meaning, can we open without it or not? So having that kind of a filter on your spreadsheet, like some of those new ideas, the scope creep that happens, maybe that is mission critical. Maybe it really was a missing piece that, holy cow, we didn't even know that that was a thing. And we found out it was, and it is absolutely critical. And that was bigger scope that we didn't know about, but we're gonna have to get it done. Versus that's a new idea and that'd be cool, but if it happened a year or two down the road, that's not the end of the world. So after opening becomes a list of, once you're settled into opening, so you've gotten your operations underway, then you can come back to that after opening list and work through the priorities that you still think are important. Next is rolling wave planning, and this, in my opinion, is one of my favorite things that I learned from doing my PMP, and it's such a simple, intuitive concept. Basically, it says that we can't see the future. We can't. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, so let's not plan for it. Let's not spend a whole lot of energy trying to plan for something that's 6 months from now. Let's plan this week, maybe even loosely the next couple weeks. But as far as like really getting specific, we don't need a plan for 16 weeks from now. We need to focus on right now and what that looks like. So rolling wave planning looks like progressive elaboration. We get specific on where we are right now and we let the rest fill in as we work through the pieces that we've assigned to ourselves right now. That'll be cleared because we'll have done that work. We now know that information. And now from this new vantage point, we've educated ourselves to know these are the next few things that need to happen in the next week or two. And as we complete that work and so on. So that again is a stress management tool as much as anything else, I feel like, for the project manager, again, to be able to effectively communicate also, because unless it's happening right now, you don't know. So when are you going to open? That was the most common question that we got as we were building the store, is when are you going to open? And we don't know. We honestly don't know. And until we were within a couple weeks, it was so hard to know how fast everything is going to be able to come together. And it really is a time warp in that hot project phase where everything just forces itself together in the last minute. And it really does happen that fast. So it's It's a communication tool to be able to say, here's what I can tell you is specifically we're working on getting quotes for new and used refrigeration equipment. And from there, we're going to try to figure out which is the better investment, and then we'll be able to see what exactly does that look like to get a hold of that equipment. So that's all I can share right now. So that's a good example of how do you communicate without really telling them anything. Like, that's just an update on what happened, and there's no answer there. There's barely any progress. That's just what we intend to do. But again, that relationship with the community is really, really important. And the sooner you feel comfortable approaching them and building a relationship, the more warm and inviting your store will feel to them by the time you actually get open. Not to mention, as they get to watch the process unfold, they definitely invest energetically. They're very interested and intrigued and curious. And that's why the first week, everybody comes. Everybody comes to see what you've done. So that first impression is very important. And again, these tools for project management help us make sure that we land on that finish line of our grand opening, making the first impression that we intended to make. Next, we'll get into requirements versus tasks. So these sound a lot the same, and the distinctions are important as far as like how to use the rest of the documents that I've included here for you. So requirements are more high level. Like, I want to open a bakery deli inside the grocery store. I want the bakery deli to have baked goods, fresh multiple days a week, and hot food multiple days a week. And that's my requirement. That's what needs to happen. Tasks are step by step by step by step by however many steps it takes to accomplish a requirement. Like, I want a bakery deli. Spoiler alert, it's a couple hundred tasks to get that done, as far as collecting quotes and evaluating quotes and selecting the final equipment and making arrangements to purchase it and making arrangements to receive it and making sure that you have muscle there to help you receive it, and on and on and on with the level of detail that is actually required to get from point A to point B. No bakery deli to bakery deli. There's a lot of steps in between that really we begin with the end, the requirement of where do we want to end up. That's why that dreaming phase at the beginning is so important, so that we know our final destination, and then we can just walk it backwards. Oh, you want fresh baked goods? You're going to need an oven, right? That's pretty obvious. And if you want hot food, you need a hot case. So now we know the equipment, and from there we know that you can do used or new. So we have another layer of we need to investigate that. And to investigate means getting quotes. So that probably means a research phase as far as who are we even going to get quotes from. So you just work your way backwards into where do you want to end up and how would you go about getting there. A few more vocab words, just because I know how much we all love those. For real, I do. So I don't know if you're the same, but constraints, dependencies, and traceability. So these are, again, things that are going to play a part when we get over to the task tracking spreadsheet. But these things are important to keep track of. So the constraints look like limitations in the physical world that will need to be respected. So the example that I've given is we're not going to update the electrical, so the appliance will have to fit into this amount of power that's coming through the plug where they're going to plug into. So that's a constraint within the environment that the oven or whatever other equipment needs to fit inside of that. That's just one example. There's obviously lots of examples. Dependencies are a little bit different. Dependencies say there's a specific order that the tasks need to happen in. So for example, I almost got ahead of myself by having the concrete floor finishing guys come, and thank goodness they talked me through it enough to realize it wasn't time for that yet, because the plumber hadn't installed the drainage for the drips off the refrigeration. So that was going to include cutting into our concrete floor, laying that plumbing, and then refilling it with new concrete. So that's a dependency where I can't have the floor guys come until after the plumber is finished and the concrete work is dry, so that it can all get finished in the same floor. So that's a really clear example and a mistake I almost made of having to have like this another patch of your floor like recovered. So that's obviously not what you want. So keeping track of dependencies as they show up inside of your tasks, where you realize, oh, I can't do this until I get this one done. And so we'll get into, when we look at the spreadsheet, how that actually plays out and how you would keep track of that on the spreadsheet. So for requirements versus tasks in the documentation, there's a very detailed example. Hopefully that helps as far as how to break down a requirement into the tasks needed to actually get that requirement completed. And last on the task list, we will get more into this when we look at the spreadsheet, but the ID numbers in that first column, I highly recommend. You don't have to use them, but it helps just tie it all together in a way where what we ended up having was like, there's a lot of different tasks that sound really similar, and maybe they all are assigned to the same person, maybe they're assigned to different people, and you get them confused. So yeah, that unique identifier is a nice way to speak to your project teammates about certain tasks and just make sure that you're all looking at the exact same information. Again, it's a communication tool to make sure that you're not having those miscommunications. Next is budget management, and real quick, the budget includes the time almost as much as it does the money. So meaning the schedule and what we would normally think of as the budget. We want to know not only how much is it going to cost, but how long is it going to take. And so when we're collecting quotes, especially, that's something to make sure that we get from every single quote that we're dealing with is, what is the turnaround time to make this happen? So I appreciate that you're my cheapest price, and I love that, but you know, when can you get this done? Oh, it wouldn't be till next year. Well, crap, because I need this done right now. So I'm gonna have to choose somebody who's quoting me a higher price because I need the schedule that they can provide versus the cheapest price. So time is not to be underestimated as far as the importance of this resource on your project. Next, we'll talk a little bit about stakeholders. So there is a template for this as well that we'll cover later on, but really you're just trying to create a list of the people who are needing to know any level of detail about your project. And so you think about all the people that is. And again, the community is at the top of the list. The stakeholder that matters the most are the future customers that are going to keep your store afloat. So building that relationship with them as your primary stakeholder is very important. And then other stakeholders that you'll have are your project team. And so that includes the contractors that you're hiring, plus any of your sidekicks on your project management team. You'll also want to keep track of your vendor contacts. So especially like DSD is a good example, where you'll reach out to most likely like a regional sales office to say, hey, I'm a new store, I want to get set up. And they'll put you in contact with the regional sales rep for your area. And so keeping track of that person's contact information, again, the template that we'll go through just centralizes that information and keeps it all in one place where you can easily click print and give it to your new sidekick and be like, here's the contact information. You wouldn't have to provide contact cards or references for every single task that you ask for from them. You empower your assistants with this document that gives them all the information they would need. The last types of stakeholders that are highly encouraged, I don't think any of these are technically required, but most of them sound like they maybe should be. So those would be the banker, the insurance agent, any consultants that are providing expertise on your project, your board of directors, your attorney, your accountant, and any of your personal or business mentors. So these people are there to help in this progressive elaboration of your plan. As you go through more, you'll know more, and you'll be able to plan better for what you're gonna face here in the next little while. And especially people with this kind of expertise, most of us don't have specific insurance knowledge. Most of us don't have specific tax knowledge. So keeping these people in the loop as we go is so much easier to make sure that as you're building something, you're building it in a way that is ultimately going to work once it's done. And these are the people who would tell you that that's what you're building. I think keeping them in the loop just ensures that the accuracy of what you're building while you're building it is right on target. And again, to me, that's a stress management tool for the project manager, because as a project manager, you're good at managing large amounts of information and communicating details as necessary. So knowing the ins and outs of tax law and banking requirements and accounting and all of that may not be your jam, and it doesn't have to be. So especially if you feel at all out of your depth, making sure that these kinds of stakeholders are a regular part of your process is an easy way to relieve your stress about not knowing all the things. That brings us to the end of the project management concepts. So next we will go through the template for the project charter. And again, this is a tool to help get clear, especially in the very first part of the initiating phase. Especially if you're a project manager who is working under a bigger authority figure on the project. This is a document that helps to outline the authority level of the project manager in regards to decision making, because on the course of the project, there are a ton of decisions that need to be made. So empowering the project manager by figuring out up front what kinds of things is the project manager able to just decide and move forward, what kinds of decisions need to be collected and amalgamated and sit down with the higher authority figure and go through the decisions and make those together. And then the project manager goes and implements what decisions were made. So figuring that out early, again, helps to avoid the miscommunications that can happen. This is a very high-level document, so pretty much all of these sections are just a couple sentences. It's just to help tie together all the high-level pieces, meaning the authority figure and the one who's managing the project, and outlining expectations between the two. So you're not meant to know all the details right now. That's what the business plan and the executive summary that we'll get into next, that's where we'll do that elaboration. So overall high-level vision of the project purpose and justification. Why do you need to do this? Typically, especially if we're talking about a grocery store, there's a lot of money getting invested. So the justification should probably sound something like, there's profit to be made here. This is a worthwhile investment of some kind. Okay, project objectives. These are super high level pieces of what the finished product will include. And within these objectives, there are 3 different kinds of objectives to think about. The scope objectives would be the actual business that you want to exist at the end. What should it have? It should have a bakery, it should have a meat counter, etc. The financial objectives say something like, we are securing $900,000 to do this project, so my financial objective is to keep the cost of the project under $900,000. So those would be the types of financial. And then quality is, how do you want to judge if you did a good job? Like, that's kind of a component that, it's none of these are required, and this one is just going that much further above and beyond. How will you know at the end if you've met your target? So this could look like good customer reviews after opening day. Like in the first week, we want to see 25-star reviews on our Facebook page. That's, going to tell us that we did a good job. Things like that can fill in that quality piece. Milestones. This is a big high-level timeline of what are the big pieces that need to happen. A good example is to secure your funding, evaluate POS systems or point of sale systems, hire your staff, purchase your equipment, have it installed. These are like the big steps that need to happen for you to get to whatever final vision you're trying to create in your project. Definition of project success. Again, remember, we're in a document where we're trying to create harmony between the highest level authority of the project itself, who's wanting this, who's paying for it, whose energy is mostly giving the final authority for the project, and then who's making most of the day-to-day work and decisions and that kind of thing. So this document is aiming to provide harmony between the two. So creating that definition of success, this is an opportunity to say what the success would look like to each party. and to get them on the same page and to have some conversations around that. Chances are you're having conversations through this document. Now, whether you come back and actually fill it out and sign it on the last page, like there is a signature page to do, that's up to you. I mean, it can just serve as an agenda for a conversation, but I personally, there's so much that happens in a project. The less that you leave inside your memory, the more you write down and put it on paper and store it somewhere so that you can come back to it later, the easier life is. It's a stress management tool. A high-level budget summary, that's pretty straightforward as far as the money that you expect to spend and the categories that you see that being allocated to. The high-level risks and responses, so these are things generally that would happen outside of your control. What might happen that could hurt the business. These risks are things that don't exist yet, but it could happen in the future. So things like an economic downturn where our community is impacted. Like, for example, in my town, if the local sausage plant went out of business, there would be a lot of unemployed folks here in my community. So that would impact the amount of market there is in the first place for my store to do business. So that would alter the success and the outcome of my business. And that outcome, that sausage plant closing down and all these people being unemployed, that has nothing to do with me. It's outside of my control. So what would I do if an economic downturn happened? And what that ends up looking like is in your financial forecasting, which we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the business plan. Make multiple scenarios to account for these risks and say, like, worst case scenario, if there was a really bad year or two, here's what that would look like in my financial projections, and be really honest with yourself about that. You don't do any favors by hiding that information from yourself. That's not to say that you need to take every single forecast that you ever make and share it with your banker. You can be selective about how you represent your project, but doing it for yourself and giving yourself your own peace of mind to say that this makes sense even if this risk happens, that's ultimately what the point of that section is thinking through what could happen, and if that happened, what would be the likely outcome to our business, and what would the ripple effects of that be? And as much as you can, right, some things are just flat out outside your control, but as much as you can, you bake the solution to the risk into the initial build. So again, this is that first step of how could this go wrong? And based on that, we build the solution into what we're doing. Agreements looks like anything that's already in place, where this relationship already exists. I've already secured the funding. It's coming through this banker. Those kinds of things that are already established. Again, this is putting the owner of the project and the project manager on the same page. So that's where that would be disclosed. Next is enterprise environmental factors. So these are rules and regulations, factors of your environment that exist, again, outside of your control, and these are limits that you're having to work within. A good example are the food safety regulations in your state that tell you frozen product has to be kept at a certain temperature, refrigerated product has to maintain a certain temperature, and if your refrigeration isn't able to maintain the food at that temperature, you are breaking the rules. So let's say you ignored that environmental factor of this rule of food having to be at a certain temperature, and you had your refrigeration installed and it didn't go down low enough temperature-wise to keep the food at the right temperature. So knowing what are those environmental factors that we need to be aware of, that is super important before you get too far down the road. And so I've baked some of that into the other modules as far as trying to point you in the right direction for finding out what are the environmental factors that you need to consider. So that information will fall in whatever module it fits into. Organizational process assets. So these would really only apply if you are managing a transition of a store, like from one management to another. If this is a brand new store, brand new build, there really won't be organizational process assets. These would be things like, the company already owns Microsoft Office and maybe you can keep their license, or the POS stays with the the store and you're just inheriting that technology, there's lots of ways that the infrastructure can already be set up for you to where you're not having to do that. And organizational process assets is where you acknowledge these are the tools that already exist within the organization that I'm going to use to complete this project. And so again, when you're doing this from scratch, there's really not. So that's why you start with Google Drive, then you get your Microsoft Office, and you start building up your assets, your process assets, basically the tools that you use to manage the process itself. The last section is very blatantly the authority level of the project manager. And again, that's to streamline the decision-making process, hoping to empower the project manager with as much decision-making power as you feel comfortable giving them. And that just helps the entire process unfold more smoothly. And really, you can feel more confident giving them more power by having more detailed discussions and setting expectations and documenting them inside of a document like this, so that again, everybody's on the same page, we all sign the same document. And then if there ever is an issue, it's easy to point back to that and reassess the expectations that were initially set out. And then I've included the signatures page if you want to use that. And I did bake in a second key decision maker just to kind of allude to if there is another person involved in the project that would have their own decision-making power separate from the project manager, really this document can serve that purpose as well. So next we'll go to the executive summary, and this is where you'll begin to elaborate on the detail of what you established in the project charter. And this is identifying lots of different things. And the most important thing to keep in mind with the executive summary is this is used as a communication tool with key stakeholders like your banker, or if ever you need additional funding. This document is really helpful to stand alone, to send somebody like, here's the project I'm doing, and it has enough information for them to judge it initially as far as something that they want to be involved in or not, and can facilitate a bigger conversation from there. So you'll introduce your management team, give a background story on your business and how this is coming to be. That's where, again, you're probably dealing with stakeholders who haven't bought into your business yet. If they're reading this executive summary, it's helping to get them up to speed and in alignment with your business. So that backstory especially, and including your thought process, why this is so important to you, all of that can be really powerful in helping people to get on board with what it is that you're trying to create. Products and services, that's where you're getting even more specific. Who your ideal customer base is, what is it that the customers are looking for, and how are you going to provide that for your customers. Marketing and sales, how you intend to engage with the community or your ideal customer base. And then last but not least, your financing requirements. So this is super high level still. You're just big picture outline, what money do you need to make this project happen? Again, this is used in the very early stages to sell the project to new stakeholders. Next, we'll get into the business plan, and this is a tool for you. And so this is probably the main one that I recommend you really do fill this out. It's really not for anybody besides you and the success of your project. So even if you're not the project manager, if you're the project owner, this is still a helpful template to go through, to think through. This is in that early dreaming phase, the business plan phase, where we're trying to get as clear as we possibly can in our imagination about the final destination that we're trying to land at. So here we insert the executive summary. That's a copy and paste out of that document into this one. So that level of detail is already established. So everything else that we're going to get into in these sections is going to be a whole nother level of detail, and that is the point. So it may be easy to say, well, I don't know, and like rolling wave planning, I thought I wasn't supposed to know all these things yet, and that's fine. This is all still technically high level. We haven't gotten to making a to-do list yet. That's not till we get to the spreadsheet template. But in order to know what to-do list to make, we have to know what are the requirements of what it is that we're trying to create. The first section that's new here is competitive advantage. And this is helpful to think through, why would customers shop at your store compared to their other options? And whether there's stores in town where you're competing with like a Dollar General or something like that. So your competitive advantage is specialty meats, and we have deli meats and cheeses and they don't have that. And so you have things at your store that the other store doesn't have. Or maybe your competitive advantage right now is that there is no other store in town and the closest option is 20-minute drive away. And that's a really great competitive advantage to have. And that's a perfect example of something that should go on the risks and responses, as far as if that's your main competitive advantage, that would change a lot if Dollar General decided to open up in your town. And that's not anything that you can control. So the risk would be Dollar General opening, and now our competitive advantage of being the only show in town has dried up. It's no longer a thing. And doing some financial projections around what you think that might look like or do to your business. Competitors, so elaborating on what are the other options that customers have. Sourcing and fulfillment, those are all of the different places where you intend to get your products from. So chances are, especially if we're talking grocery stores, you have a warehouse that you're going to work with to do the bulk of your wholesaling. And then local vendors that you have in your area. That was a really important competitive advantage for our store, was that we sold local products, where our main competitor is Walmart, and they work with a national set. So they don't typically carry the local products that are only in our county. So being able to bring those in is a really nice competitive advantage to take advantage of. And then last but not least, DSD vendors. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the last month of planning module, as far as working with all of the different pop vendors, bread vendor, milk vendor, on and on and on, to make sure that your store is carrying the range of products that you mean to carry. Thinking through the technology that will be required. So some examples of what that looks like, especially if this is a new grocery store, you'll need a point of sale system. That includes wiring requirements, that includes certain wireless internet requirements, that the arms and legs of needing a POS system, it grows. And so that's where thinking through what are the technology requirements, and like I didn't feel comfortable approaching that myself, so I sought expertise in the technology realm to help be my guide in that area and help me evaluate the quotes that I got and help me shop around for cheaper equipment options and all of that. I outsourced that to somebody else who was an expert so that they could help make sure that I was at least navigating and making informed decisions, because I didn't feel confident doing that myself. So whatever area that might be for you, that's definitely something to keep in mind. So department operations and specific services, this is again like to help you get really clear on what it is that you're wanting to do. For example, if you want a meat market or a meat counter, that is very vague, that's very broad. So some examples of making that more specific might look like, my meat counter is going to be an old-fashioned meat case where the meat is out and fresh and that's unwrapped and the customer can see it and they can pick out which steak they want. And I pull it out of the case and I weigh it on the scale and I print a tag for it and I wrap it up in white butcher paper and I give it to the customer. So that's one example of a service that your meat market might provide. The deli meats and cheeses, being able to vac pack things, so vacuum seal packages. So that's how we package chicken breast and whatever. That vac pack though, that's part of the food safety environmental factors to be aware of. There's a special plan, a special application that has to be filed and special approval that your store has to receive to be allowed to vac pack basically anything. So that's other planning that needs to happen. And if you don't do it in the planning stage leading up to opening, when you open, you won't be able to use your backpack machine. So those kinds of environmental factors, helpful to bake in as early as possible. And that comes from getting really specific on the department operations that you want to have. That helps you to know what questions do you even need to ask when we start getting into how to explore the environmental factors that apply to your project. Location and human resources is talking about the facility that you're planning to use. If you don't have a facility yet, that's where you would list out your real estate requirements of what you're shopping for, and maybe you use that to think through that for yourself and then work with a real estate agent. If you already have your location, go ahead and fill that part in. And then human resources, it's like, who are your employees going to be, and what does your staff even need to look like? And especially if it's a brand new build, that can be really difficult to imagine. So that's why we're trying to dream about it and plan it out as much as we can loosely here right up front, just to have a sense of who is it that we even need to be around when we open. So you can see I listed some examples of how you might go about listing out the positions that you'll have within your staff. And then also, like, how many part-time employee positions are you working with? And really, as far as a grocery store and in any kind of business where you're going to pay close to minimum wage, the high school kids in your community are going to be a huge part of your human resource pool. And so figuring out your age limit requirements, what you're willing to work with. In the state where I live, there are age limits that go down to 14. They can work, but they have to be done by 7 p.m. They can't work more than a certain number of hours. So as an employer, you either have to follow those rules or don't employ 14-year-olds. Wait till they're 15 or 16 or whatever. So that's for you to make as far as a business owner. And so that's the kind of stuff that you'll think about in terms of who is the human resource pool that you're aiming to hire out of. The termination security protocol, again, that's something to think about as far as just have it in mind as you're building, and then every time you come across a new piece of access that you're building for employees, like, oh, we have a back door where they have key fobs, and so, okay, so that needs to go on the termination protocol. Like if you had to inactivate an employee or fire them, or they quit, or whatever the circumstance was, they got arrested mid-shift, you don't know what's gonna happen. That's the beautiful thing about a grocery store. You need to know what are the steps that I need to take as soon as possible to make sure that this non-employee no longer has access to employee areas or related information. The customer market analysis, depending on the warehouse that you're working with or what kind of project you're doing to begin with, like our grocery warehouse offered this as a service that they would provide. We could pay a certain amount for them to do one for us. We opted not to do that. And more did some estimates ourselves as far as what we thought the potential revenue for the store would be and what we thought the weekly spend on groceries was for our community. And I can tell you that based on our initial study and plan and implementation, and then what happened within the couple years after we opened, there was a greater need for the dollar product price point than we had originally recognized. So our main competitive advantage was quality, and we had a way lower income base of customers than we were expecting that basically didn't have the disposable income to spend on a high quality product. So that was limiting their buying options inside the store. So we didn't know that at the beginning, but that didn't stop us from recognizing it and adding in basically dollar options to every single category. So these are the kinds of reasons that you would want to be really clear about the demographics and the community that you're intending to serve. Pricing is something to get specific about as far as how you intend to be competitive. And this, I would say, is important whether there's another store in town or not. It's obviously a lot more important if you do have a direct competitor in your area. But this is where customers know the price of things. So knowing ahead of time, what are you willing to make a 25 to 30 to 40% margin on? And what are you willing to make a 5% margin on in order to give them a nice price? And again, going back to your primary stakeholder is your community. Your primary stakeholder is your customer base. So how can you work with them? How can you give them a really nice price on milk and maybe your produce margin is 40%? Because you do put a lot more labor into produce, and for milk, you know that you're selling enough volume to justify a lower profit margin. You also want to achieve that lower price point on the shelf for the customer to see. So it's possible to get that granular, and maybe milk is the only product in your whole store that you're doing that with. Most likely, again, going back to your warehouse, they have a list of the top products across their warehouse, the top selling products, and these are the name brand, like Kraft mayo, like those kinds of things, like Heinz ketchup, like the main products. And they can provide that list, and that can also be a good starting point to look at. Maybe we minimize the margin on those products and give the customer a better deal and leave some of the more obscure specialty products at a higher margin. Key community partners is another really great thing to think about as soon as possible, because this is a way to basically lock in a certain chunk of weekly sales. So places like the hospital or assisted living facilities, the schools, places where they're already clearly using food from somewhere, and that somewhere could be you. You know, never hurts to ask. And that was my motto. I called everybody in town, and we started with 2, and we now have more key community partners, people who have standing orders with us every week. Maybe it's not exactly the same set of stuff every time. Maybe it is. Some of them are like that, but some of them send us a list every week and we shop it for them, and that's $1,200 a week that they needed groceries and they were going to buy it from somewhere, and they decided they wanted to do business with us. So now that's $1,200 every Friday that comes in the door. So establishing those relationships can be really good just to provide that much stability into your weekly sales. Promotion is very literally, how do you plan to promote your business? How do you plan to tell people that you're there? That was probably the most shocking thing, that there would be people 3 and 4 years into the store being opened that are like, I didn't even know you guys were here. And you just look at them and you're like, man, for all the promotional efforts I've ever done, that's kind of a slap in the face, but that's okay. I'm glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. So yeah, how are you going to let them know that you exist? And this is where I say, get creative, be diverse. There's so many different options that are totally free. There are ways to volunteer within the community, within other organizations that are already doing work within the community. Donating things to like local law enforcement, or making donations to the school when they ask for it, or those kinds of things. Like, it helps them value that relationship with you and know that they can come to you and you'll help them as much as you can. And those kinds of relationships, they tend to blossom into really loyal customers. And that's even beyond, you know, the person who is always the one to call from the school, who's always ordering the stuff. She also, in her spare time, is coming to the store and shopping at the store. So it's like building that relationship, those ripple effects, they go way beyond just the key community partners, just the ways that you're stepping into some different organizations around your community. Those ripple effects, they grow into customer loyalty. So investing in those early on especially is very important, even in the planning phase, so that you make sure you have a customer base who's ready the day that you open the door. The in-store customer experience, it's like, picture the customer walking into your store. What happens? What do you want them to see when they enter? What do you want them to smell? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to hear? Will there be music? Should the cashier greet them out loud? Is that an expectation you should set with your with your employees? Yes. It's those kinds of things. What is the experience that the customer should have? And again, this is in the vein of, we want to be as clear as possible with that finished product so that we can work our way backwards and bake those solutions into what we're creating as we're creating it. Strategy and implementation. This is a very high-level timeline. Financial plans, statements, and sales forecasts. So this is where, if you have historical financials, you'll want to familiarize yourself and summarize those here into the historical financials category. Either way, you're going to want to do some projected financials. That's where you're basically filling in balance sheets and projecting out what you think the monthly expenses are going to be, what you think the monthly revenue might be. And that's where it's good to have high, medium, and low scenarios in the revenue category and the expense category. Like, if labor was 10% of our weekly revenue, what does that look like? If labor bumps up to 13% of our weekly revenue, what does that look like? So playing with both your expenses and your revenue, and just getting yourself familiar and convinced yourself personally that this is possible and it's worth creating. That's the goal of the business plan, is that it should be so clear. The finish line should be so clear that it's effortless to work your way backwards and figure out what are the steps I need to take to get there. And last, a 5 to 10 year timeline. This is good for you and for anybody else that you're working with on the project, just so that everybody's on that same page of what is the ultimate goal as far as these next 5 to 10 years. So next we're going to look at the stakeholders template, and this is very straightforward, and we already talked about the stakeholders and why we manage them. So I listed some examples of who might wind up on this spreadsheet. I suggest keeping their phone number and email address. Sometimes you even end up with multiple phone number columns if you happen to have multiple numbers for somebody. Project management team is just a yes/no column, just to help you keep track of who is the project management team. And a lot of times, like, you'll send out mass emails to different stakeholder groups, and so a column like that, like project management team, lets you filter on the spreadsheet and select the yeses, and that way you can just copy and paste the yes emails, the project management team emails, and send a mass email to the project management team. The project role, so what is their role within the project? That seems pretty straightforward, and again, this is in the vein of printing this document and handing it over to a new person who just joined your project and empowering them to know. So if you say, like, hey, I need you to call the plumber and double check with him when he's going to come, they don't need to ask you who the plumber is, what's his phone number, blah, blah, blah. Like, on the document, it says project role, plumber, and it's this guy, call him and see what's going on. Frequency of updates, that's just for your own reference as the project manager. How often does each group need to be kept in the loop? And when it comes to project management and communication in general, I would say err on the side of over communicating with your stakeholders, especially the more important they are. Better to give them more information than they need than less. And last but not least, we'll take a look at the task tracking and scheduling dependencies spreadsheet. And same, I feel like we already talked about this, so we'll run through it real quick. The item name is where you give a very high level description of the item, and this is where, again, you can wind up with things that sound a lot alike and you can get confused on what's what. That's where the notes column on the far right, the description, the notes, like, that's where you can put additional information, and hopefully the notes history helps to keep track of which task is which, along with the unique identifier. The statuses, this is not a comprehensive list. If you have other statuses that make sense for your project, by all means, add whatever you want. Mission critical, we talked about that as far as does it need to be done in order to cross the grand opening threshold? If not, then there's after opening. So no, it's not mission critical. And so again, especially as you get through into that hot project phase where there's so much going on, I'm constantly like pulling the list of yes, mission critical, and I'm moving things into the no, not mission critical. We don't need that, never mind. Like, there's so much going on. We can wait. So reevaluating that one, especially as you get closer, sometimes that's necessary, and it helps once you get closer to be able to see clearly like what truly is mission critical and what can maybe wait until after. Project area and additional areas, pretty straightforward. It's like, you know, the refrigeration equipment is a good example of that. Has a lot of arms and legs into electrical updates, plumbing updates, yada, yada, yada. And so to do a status update, like with your project owner or something like that, if they want to know where are we at with refrigeration, to be able to filter for that project area of refrigeration, and here's what we've completed, here's what's in progress, here's what's scheduled, here's what's not started yet, and you have a easy peasy list of here's the status of that. So that can keep kind of like categories of these tasks tied together so that you can quickly and easily see where you're at in any one area of the project. Dependent on task number, so we talked about dependencies and how, you know, you got to finish the plumbing and re-pour the concrete before the floor can be finished. So in that case, I would put on the floor finishing task that this is dependent on this plumbing task. So if I go, like somebody's looking at this document and they're like, why the hell isn't the plumbing or why isn't the floor finished yet? They would go and look at that dependencies column and see, oh, it's waiting on the plumbing. Okay, well, why isn't the plumbing fixed yet? And they'd go look at the plumbing tasks. So that's how you would be able to use the document to try to figure out, where is the bottleneck? Why are we not moving forward? Why are we not on schedule? Where's the breakdown? Where do I need to speed this back up and get us moving ahead again? The project team contact, early on, this is probably just you, like on every single thing, but once there's hundreds of items on this list, chances are there will be at least a handful of people who are assigned to actually manage the details of that thing getting done. So for example, like we needed to buy an open sign. So that was a super easy thing to delegate to somebody else who was brand new to the project. Assign Jeff. Great. He's going to research, he's going to find a few options, he's going to present the few options, we're going to pick one, he's going to order it, he's going to make sure it gets there, and he's going to make sure that the contractor hangs it up. So all the details that go into the open sign, that's Jeff's job. So that's what the project team contact shows. Again, if something is not on schedule, it's not happening, then we look to, hey, Jeff, what's going on with the open sign? Tell me about that. The due date is pretty straightforward. That's just, when do we need to see this happen? Again, especially if there's dependencies. If you're missing this due date and this other thing is dependent, if you miss the due date, you need to call this other person and tell them, hey, we need to push back our start date because this due date got missed. And so all of it's tied together and needs to be managed like that. So the last column is elaborated description and project notes. So I gave an example there, and this is how I would recommend you use the column, just because again, at the end of the project, when you've had thousands of updates run through your brain, you'll be so glad that you had all of the different steps. Like if you come back to a task that's not finished, did I call him? Did I talk to him? Did he say he was coming? Now I got to call him again. I don't know. I don't know what happened, because again, when you're managing a large project, the point of a large project is that it's now outside the realm of humanly possible to contain the details within yourself. So leaving them in a list like that can really just help to, again, manage your stress. So that brings us to the end of this training module for project management. I hope you found it helpful. I would love to hear from you. My contact information is below. If you need anything, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you again to the North Central Regional Planning Committee for partnering with me on these trainings, and be sure to check out the other modules to see if there's anything else there that may be helpful for you. Until next time, you take such good care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.